Hello, welcome back to another instructional video, library development and library features that are available to you. And in this video, we're going to discuss breaking up side finished end panels with mid-rails, mid-styles, and also breaking up side face frames into multiple panels. So we see here we have a pretty typical kitchen, and we have some scenarios where we added the typical mid-rails to our cabinets through the familiar choices of the product prompts and our door options, and we have some local variables called add door mid rails and controlling where that mid rail sits in height in our Z origin here, door mid rail height there, and that's our Z origin. And those are some typical ways that you would add a mid rail. Some of the other ways that we might be able to add mid rails and mid styles to our applied finished ends, here are 5 pieces, is through our door wizard. If we access our door wizard here, we have some typical overall variables for our job. These would be driving those local prompts. Here we have a base door setting that we could already have it on by default and at a typical height by default, and we have the subsequent settings for the upper and double doors and talls, and you'll find the same settings. So we could even have uppers and talls drive differently with the mid-rail or not. As well, there's also the door lookup table, which we'll go access that through the spreadsheet really quick in your door wizard. In your door style table, the lookup table door, the big door table here, one of the main ones. Let's go ahead and scroll up here. And for any particular door style, we could have in column 11 here, if we had a panel quantity of 2, it would automatically kick on a mid style, and that would be for our doors and our finished ends. By default, that style would have a mid style. Or also our column 45 as well for our door style. Let's go over there, 45. If we had that on, it would kick on a mid rail. So as far as the finished end goes, really the only part that's in your finished ends and typically that can turn on per the door style is a mid style. And adding mid rails and anything beyond that, you're going to need to use our tall applied finished end panel. If we were to look at a regular base applied finished end here on our base cabinet, our base island here, if we go through our main product prompts first, like the door options, we saw had as a mid rail here, but the finishing options for our finished end, we don't see any add mid rails or styles out in the local prompts. And that's because they live at the subassembly prompts. If we subassembly prompt this base finished end here, we'll see that we don't have any multi-panel options. Basically, we just have default style and rail widths and so on and so forth. And we don't have any ability inside of a base left finished end solid wood to add mid rails. But where we'll find those options is in a tall panel. Not even in a typical upper will we find that feature, but in a tall panel, that's where we find that feature. So if we subassembly prompt this applied finished end panel, the tall, we'll see we have a tab beyond the typical main tab called multi-panel options. And in here, this is where we would break up our panel with these choices. So we're going to talk about those choices in just a moment here. But one thing we're going to see is, again, if we were to subassembly prompt this upper here, the upper and the base, just like I showed you previously, the upper as well doesn't have those multi-panel options. But something we have, since only the tall has those multi-panel options in there, is we have a local prompt called use tall. Under our finishing options here, we have a use tall applied finished ends. And what that'll do is change the subassembly name to a tall applied finished end, which has those multi-panel options. So once we do that, we'll be able to subassembly prompt and see that it's now using a tall with our multi-panel options. So we'll go ahead and subassembly prompt that guy again. And we see now we have our multi-panel options. So let's just go through some of the scenarios and how these multi-panel options work. So let's look at that multi-panel prompt choices again. Let's briefly explain some of the features, and then we'll do some real examples in this kitchen. So we'll look at the multi-panel options here. And what we see in front of us in the middle right here, we see the quantity of panels vertically, and we also see some radio buttons in the middle here and some choices. So it's pretty small amount of prompts, but prompts will dynamically appear based on the choices, and we'll get more and more choices based upon what we've entered here. We can add mid styles and other things once we'll see here, but first thing I'm going to explain is probably the main thing is simple panel calculation versus custom panel calculation. So simple panel calculation, what that is for is if you're just going to break it up for an adjacent upper cabinet and a base cabinet, as we see over here to the right. And we will get mid rails, and we'll see this, we'll see mid rails, and we'll see the quantity of panels vertically adjust based upon our checkboxes over here. So basically, we're adding mid rails by saying if there's an adjacent base cabinet or there's an adjacent upper cabinet, and it'll add the mid rails accordingly. So if we said there's a base cabinet, we see that it changed it to quantity panels vertically, and it's going to add a mid rail behind the scenes. But as well, it's also adding a lower style, which we'll see in a moment here, and in actual real world here in a cabinet. And it's adding the lower mid rail as well automatically. So a lot of these are formula driven behind the scenes. So if you unclick this and you try to change some of these options, you'll have to restart by reverting the subassembly and coming back in here to get it to work the way it does from the start with formula driven stuff behind here. Okay, so again, we can control that how many mid rails are being added by these checkboxes. So if I have an upper and a lower, I click that on. Now it's created 3 panels vertically and added an upper mid rail and a lower mid rail, and it's also added a top style and a lower style. Okay, and that's for a simple panel calculation where you're just controlling it by these checkboxes. Well, custom, if you click over to custom, basically they have a new pull down here which you can pick what you want, and by you controlling this, it's automatically adding the rails accordingly over here, and then you can add the styles and what you want. All right, let's go back to simple panel calculation here. So by checking those on, we see we have some default settings here of our base adjacent cabinet height, upper cabinet depth and height, and those are used in where to place those Z locations of the mid rails and the Y locations of the mid styles. So these by default are set to look to your global settings of what your product defaults are in the project, but you can change those just right here and they'll change accordingly. And these are formula driven behind the scenes. You kind of see that there, but you can always override that. And you can individually override. Over here on the main tab, you have your defaults for your door style or your finished end style, what the mid rail should be. But once you start adding individual mid rails and breaking this up, you can override those independently, the lower style widths, top style widths over here. So that's what those are. Some other things are these lower minimal panel minimum width. Basically, those are what size it'll still allow a panel. And so you can control those thresholds here, and we'll see how that plays out in a moment. So those are some of the settings you'll see in here, and how they work we'll explain in a moment. And hopefully you understand the difference between simple and custom at this point. And let's just go ahead and do some examples here. So here we have a reefer cabinet, and we have this panel here. And so maybe on this one we're just going to break that up decoratively into 6 panels here and add some mid styles and mid rails. So let's go back to those subassembly prompts, and let's just go ahead and break those up. So go to our multi-panel options. In this case, I'm just going to do custom. I want to do 3, and I'm going to go ahead and add a top style, a mid style, and a lower style. And let's just see what we get here. Okay, that's nice. We got a little 6 panel here, nice and decorative. Kind of pretties that up here so it's not just a big old plain finished panel. So now let's go look at the simple panel calculation here over on the left side of our oven cabinet. Let's go ahead and rotate that and see that view here. So what we see going on here is our face frame's going in here, and we got a little bit of a holiday because of the inset of the flat panel here. And this is where that simple panel calculation can come into play as one way to handle that. So let's go ahead and turn that on. We'll go subassembly prompts. And we'll do the simple panel calculation, and we'll say yes, we have an adjacent base cabinet and we have an adjacent upper cabinet. I'm not going to do anything else. And let's just see what we get here. Okay, so what we see happened here is it automatically gave me a mid-rail right at the center of my countertop height here, and it gave me a mid-rail right at the center of the bottom of my upper cabinets based on those height prompts we had in there, and a mid-style accordingly. One thing that works kind of funky, but it's, you can always customize it and change what you want, is by default, that lower mid-style, if it sees that the panel quantity or minimum panel width is met, then it's going to just kick on a solid panel. Let's just isolate that so you can really see what's going on here. So what it did is it saw that your minimum panel width of 6, it did not reach that, so it did not turn on a panel in here. It just increased that style width to bump that front style. Now that might not be the detail that you want, and depending on your layout, you can always avoid that by, changing your countertop depth to that your base cabinet depth falls right on this style, and come up with the magic numbers of how deep your tall cabinet could be versus your base cabinet, and that I'll leave that to you expert engineers, but this is what it'll do by default. And as well, you see that there's no panels back here. There's blank panels because the cabinets are covering those, and you could change that by going to your subassembly prompts again and adjusting it even further. So here we see the lower panel minimum width. We could change that because it's a flat panel. Maybe it's not as much of an issue. We can go ahead and try to fit a flat panel in there that's smaller. If it was raised panel, it might not be able to do that. But let's just change this to something like 2, and we'll see that change. And that's how we're going to handle this particular scenario. But again, you can lay that out and change anything you want there. And just to show you why those panels are off and where those prompts are controlling that. When you're in a simple panel calculation and you choose adjacent base or upper cabinet, you'll see that these prompts turn on automatically. The use top front panel or use rear panel. There you go. Use lower rear panel. Those are turning on and off depending on what you've answered here, but you can always turn them back on as needed. Let's just go ahead and unisolate, and we'll see that that detail is a little bit more acceptable. So that's some of those choices, how you would do this simple panel calculation, adjacent base, upper cabinet choices. So let's show you the right side of this oven. Maybe on the right side over here, instead of doing something decorative like the finished end of our refrigerator cabinet we broke up over here, we want to try to put some mid rails that align with our mid rails of our stiles on the front here. Well, let's show you how you can quickly do that using some of our prompts that we've already talked about, and also picking on screen those Z locations. Show you how it's intended to work here. So we can go ahead and do our custom panel calculation. In this case, we're going to say it is 3 panels high, but what we're going to do is we're going to double click inside of our lower mid rail Z here and pick on screen what we want the height of that to be. So technically this one thing to note about this little step here is our applied finished end is actually going to the floor. So we want to, it's thinking that the Z location is from the floor here, or the bottom of our applied finished end here. So we're going to want to pick from down here all the way up to here. So, but we have a similar choice up here on the front. So we're going to pick on the front just to get that distance in Z to populate so that this lines up on the right. So I'm going to click here to the midpoint right there, and we'll see it populated that distance. And then the upper mid rail Z, we'll double click in that as well, and we'll click and find that one, find the midpoint. There we go. Go ahead and draw it and see if we get our mid rails on our applied finished end to align. All right, that's looking good. Now we have some alignment there, breaking up that kind of a blank generic side applied finished end panel, pretty it up there. And then, okay, one more step. Let's just show you another application here. So we've got these upper cabinets with this mid rail and these upper cabinets, and the client said that they want a mid rail to break up that as well. So let's just do that again. And let's just make sure our used tall is on, making sure that it's turning it into a tall applied finished end panel that we spoke earlier, which has the multi-panel options. So we're going to go ahead and subassembly prompt that. And again, we'll just click on screen here So we're going to say custom. We're going to say 2. And we're going to double click in our lower mid rail Z again. And we're going to just pick a place that we know. Oh, sorry, I messed up on that one. I'm just going to click away. That's a good example. Okay, let's try that again. I didn't click in the right plane. Actually, what I want to do, since these are on the same plane, I can click here and find the perpendicular of my face frame part. Now I got the correct distance. So let's go ahead and turn that guy on. Nice. So I'm going to go ahead and do this last one really quick here. Let's just do this one as well. Okay, so now we have our mid rails over there, and we have our mid rails pretty much everywhere we want them right now. And one other thing I want to show you is a lot of times, we talked about the adjacent base cabinet, upper cabinet, and where this is one scenario of how to solve that, so you don't have any holidays there. But that might not be the most ideal way. And another typical detail here is to convert one of them just to a veneer panel, basically a generic slab within our library. And it's just like this, where you can't really, it's not practical to try to put some styles in there to align on that, obviously. And right now we have some holidays in here that we don't want, like we already talked about. But so one of the things that you're going to do here, and you'll see in the library, is in previous libraries you would, because the finished end choices were basically just one selection for what panel type it should be, 5-piece or slab or generic slab, it turns both, and you're both left and your right of a cabinet to that particular finished end panel type. Well, in the latest libraries, we have these generic slab overrides. So I've chosen a 5-piece, and both of them are 5-piece right now, but I want my right one to be a generic slab. So I can go ahead and click this override here, and basically I'm interrupting that subassembly name to not be a 5-piece for the right, but make it a generic slab in this instant. So in previous libraries, what you'd have to do is go ahead and leave it as 5-piece, and then turn off your finished end on your right side, and then use one of our standalone apply to finished ends, and then can turn that one to a generic slab. But it's a few extra steps, so hopefully this will save people time in the future. And so let's just show you how that works. I'm turning it to generic slab, and it's just going to be a veneer part now. And that should work nice for you. One thing I'm noticing is my generic slab by default has the toe kick notch on, so I'm just going to turn that off real quick in my subassembly prompts of my generic slab. And I just have a simple little turn off toe kick notch there. That way we don't have a little mouse hole right there. So that's the generic slab override. Just want to expose you to that. Okay. So that's how we break up our applied finished ends, multi-panels with mid-stiles, mid-rails. Next, we're going to show the face frame version with side face frames. So now we have the same scene here, the same kitchen, but instead of just having applied finished end panels, we have our side face frame as a different feature of how to finish the side of a cabinet here. And the side face frames work almost identical to the tall applied finished end panels as far as the prompt choices and the multi-panel options. You'll see they work pretty much exactly the same. So we just show you that interface. I'm just subassembly prompting my side finished end panel here. I'm sorry, my side face frame. And you'll see I have the same multi-panel options, and they look almost identical. There's a few more choices that we're going to talk about here in a moment. One thing to note, though, is unlike the applied finished ends, where only the multi-panel options live in the actual tall applied finished end and not the base and the upper, which is why we have a use tall applied finished end local prompt to turn that subassembly on, is the multi-panel options are available in all the face frames. So even a base here, if we were to look at a base face frame, we'll see that it has the multi-panel options. And so we can access those multi-panel options in any version, upper, tall, or base. So just make you aware of that. Another thing as well, you see that we have applied finished end panels sitting inside of here. So one thing to note about how all that works is if in your main product prompts here, how it's designed to work is if I have an applied finished end on here, applied left or right, and I also have a face frame left or right on, what it will do is it's telling the formulas inside that, hey, I want an applied finished end panel inside of here, also inside my side face frame to mimic my front. So what it does inside is those main product subassembly rows of the applied finished ends here, those turn off. See, if and applied finished end equals 1 and face frame, then turn that off. Well, where are those applied finished ends living then? Well, they're actually nested inside of our side face frames. So if we were to find our side face frames here, and we go to subassembly file and look at the subassemblies of that, we see that now our applied finished ends are nested inside of our side face frame. So if you're ever wondering where those are at, that's where they're at. And you see all the different options here that turn on and off based upon our multi-panel options that we're going to demonstrate in a moment. So I'm just going to go through the same steps of breaking up a panel that we did before, but this time with face frame parts instead of the style and rail parts of an applied finished end. So let's just go through those steps, and we might speed it up just for purposes here. So let's just go ahead and do it. Okay, so we did those really quick of our tall cabinets. Let's see how those are working. Very nice. Very similarly, hopefully you saw how they work very similar to the applied finished end panels. And so we're going to stop real quick and slow down and show you some of the additional features about the applied finished end with this base. But let's look at this upper really quick. One thing to note about how those used tall applied finished end panels work in conjunction with our side face frame here. So the customer says, well, I still want the mid rail inside my inset panel on my side finished end here. Well, because we have in our main product prompts, we have our used tall on here inside the nested as well. If we go look inside here, let's go look at our side face frame, our right side here, look at our nested. We'll see that this as well has the logic to turn to a tall if that's on. Finds it out in the local, and if it's on as well, it's still a tall. So we can subassembly prompt that side finished end panel that's nested inside our side face frame and still have the multi-panel options. So we're going to say we want to go yes into the nested, and we can turn on our multi-panel options. We'll do custom, and I happen to know, let's do 2, not 3. I know this is 20 3/8. We could pick on screen as well, but I happen to know that value, so let's just enter it. So just wanted to make you aware of that as well. And we'll see it go ahead and add our mid rail at the right height to align there. Very cool. Let's just do this other one really quick. All right, looking good. Some nice decorative additions there. So now let's just show you some of the additional features that happen to live inside of the face frame. So we have our island here, and we have on the front, we have our drawer banks. Let's go ahead and isolate that for better viewing here. We're going to go ahead and go out of here, and let's just isolate this real quick so we can really see this. And And we're going to go to a view like that. Change it back to conceptual. Okay, so we got our island all isolated here so we can see it, and these are some of the additional features that are in the side face frame. And the customer is saying, I want the drawers and the doors to mimic on the side here because I want that to come around and it's just an accent, and they just want it to look really cool like that. So those are some of the features inside the side face frame. So let's go ahead and do that. If we go to our side face frame subassembly prompts here, what the face frames have is we can go ahead and do the stuff that we've seen before. We'll change that to 2, and we'll go ahead and change the lower mid rail Z here by clicking on screen. We'll go ahead and get that in the same height here, and we'll add a top style, right, to mimic our top style between the drawers here, and we'll add a lower style to mimic this here. Okay, but then additionally here, we saw that there's a nested applied finished end panel inside our face frame. What the side face frame has as well is these radio buttons that appear whether or not to make it a finished end panel that's nested inside of there or a false front. So that's where this kind of a feature can come in handy when they want to try to mimic the face of drawers and door stacks on a finished end, or a side face frame rather. So we can say, yes, on the top I want that to be a false front here and here, but the lower I want to be finished end panels to mimic the doors. And we'll see what we get. All right, so now we're mimicking the front quite nice. Let's just do the other side really quick. Do the exact same thing on our right. All right, customer's happy. Now we have a nice accented side finished end or side face frame that mimics the front. Really cool. Let's go ahead and go back out all the way and look at our completed kitchen here. Very nice. Customer's happy. So hopefully that exposed you to where those options live to break up your side finished end panels with multiple mid rails and styles, and also your side face frames, how to break that up. And hopefully you can create a nice little kitchen.